join me. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Asmaa Al Fadala. Now, Asmaa, if I can use your first name, is the Director of Research at WISE, the Qatar-based global conference, which has very quickly, I think, achieved a massive reputation for having an impact on education systems around the world. And Asmaa is going to talk to us about what have we learned from the pandemic. And I think this is a topic that we will return to several times during our 3 days together. But Asmaa, you have the privilege of going first on it. And your presentation is...
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello, everyone. Thank you, David, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak today. The title of my talk is Re-Engineering Schools, Lessons Learned from COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm going to approach this topic from my own research lens on educational leadership and also from over 20 years experience working with the schools in my own country, Qatar, as an educator, first as a teacher, then a school leader, and now as a researcher and the director of research at WISE, the World Innovation Summit for Education, an initiative of Qatar Foundation for Education, Science, and Community Development. School reform and transformation has always been a central area of my interest, and I strongly believe that to transform education systems, we as researchers, policymakers, and the community here as a whole need to work with the schools rather than to provide them with ready policy agenda. I mean, working with schools to develop their expertise and to help them lead their learning and to have teachers and learners as co-designers for learning. This topic is also central to my first book I published in 2019 based on my PhD findings on the educational reform in Qatar. What policymakers often miss in educational reform and changes is the importance of empowering teachers on the ground. Educators, as we all know, either school leaders, teachers, administrators, play an essential role in every level of reform. And I do believe that to have sustained changes on the ground, we need to rethink the redesign of teacher professional learning and invest in teacher learning. But the question here, why teacher learning is important? Why do we need to consider this when we talk about educational reform and re-engineering schools in general? As a reminder, allow me to share this. For the past 30 years, the vast majority of educational reform efforts by governments have misplaced their focus. They have focused broadly on superficial fixes. Of course, they changed curriculum, they changed the assessment and held school principals accountable. They experimented with classroom sizes, etc. Of course, these are really important and necessary, but a key missing piece of reform efforts have been the learners and teachers themselves. These reform efforts never contemplated involving students in designing their own learning. Students and teachers have been simply been recipients of reforms instead of being owners of their learning paths. No one is talking about learners' agency and the role of students and teachers to take an active role in reform agendas. So the question here, can we fix this problem? Can we re-engineer schools? And this is the idea and concept I want to share with you all today. As an educator and researcher in the field for more than 25 years, what I've come to learn is that students will flourish, will prosper by having more say in their own learning and their learning communities. And I also can share, as a mother of 5 children in K to 12 and in higher education, this is so important when we engage and involve students and our children and their learning. This has become more evident in the last 2 years of school disruption caused by the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 had turned schooling into a universal, large-scale experiment. Education systems, schools, and classrooms have had to stop many old practices and invent new ones. However, as the schools returns, these changes may disappear, and it would be a great mistake to slip back into a pre-pandemic ways of functioning. Of course, not all of these changes are necessarily the changes we want to see and to have in our education. I mean, the pandemic had created a unique opportunity that have been proposed before even COVID, but were never fully realized. I'll focus on one of that. One of these positive changes is the role of teachers on the ground to support children's agency and the opportunity for the teachers to incubate new ideas, to test new practices on the ground, and to learn what worked and what didn't. So education providers will need to make student agency key to transforming pedagogy and school organizations. Learning has to become based on strengths, passion, and more personalized. So if the most important element in teaching and learning is helping students to cultivate essential life competencies, either problem solving, agency, teamwork, and others, this will allow them to thrive in uncertain world. So if this is the important question here, how do we change the role of students to take ownership of their learning paths? How do we make learning relevant to reflect the future world our students will inherit? How to empower teachers to support this type of learning? So without answering these questions, we will not be able to meaningfully reform education. So if we are talking about the big picture of the reform, especially the system reform, we need to think about the classroom practices, the role of teachers and students. And I'm not talking here about theories, but I will share evidence from practices and from a project I led recently. In our current traditional model, when we create educational content for the learners, we don't involve them as we should, and we do the work for them instead of doing the work with them. We also prioritize the acquisition of knowledge, whether relevant to them or not, and not the acquisition of experience. And when we do this, we forgot the following. These are important points we need to consider when we create or start a new reform agenda. Students have a natural interest about the world. They want to learn. Number two, they are diverse learners. They don't all learn the same way. Three, they are intentional learners. They are motivated to learn. When students pursue what they are good at and what is interesting and relevant to their own lives, you don't need to motivate them. You just need to support and guide them. You know, many researchers and policymakers talk about lack of motivation for students, especially here in the Gulf or the Middle East. And I think the more we focus on what is relevant and meaningful for them, not only in the classroom, but also outside the classroom, I think that we can have motivated students. This type of experiential learning is what we need to introduce in our schools so we can improve learning outcomes and close achievement gaps. And not only the academic outcomes, but also social emotional learning and well being. We need to ask ourselves if the current what and how, why of teaching and learning serves our students and our world well. Again, moving into another important question, how do we decide what is good learning? How do we transform our education that center on the acquisition of knowledge to learner-driven personalized learning? Let me repeat that type of learning, learner-driven personalized learning. What should schooling, teaching, and most importantly, learning look like in this rapidly changing world? So, to re engineer schools, we need to rethink education for the whole child, to develop the skills needed to guide and inform the redesign of learning with the learners rather than for them. We need to involve them from the design phase. We need to move to learner guided reform, where number one, learners are at the center of teaching and learning. Number two, social and emotional learning are integral to teaching. And finally, recognizing individual differences and assess for learning rather than assess of learning. I'm sure each of these points need more than an hour to explain. I'm just highlighting this and happy to answer questions after this or in the break. The concept behind a learner guided reform is so simple. Learning is best measured by students demonstrating their learning rather than the number of hours spent in a classroom. We need to change that. And COVID crisis gave us what do we mean by learning and teaching. By redesigning the education system around actual student learning, we will prepare each student more effectively for a future in an increasingly global and competitive economy. So the question here, how do we help schools leapfrog toward this deep change? And I'm on purpose using the leapfrog because we need deep change from the traditional way. How to shift the focus from traditional teaching to a teaching that supports learner-guided reform. And this is not a new question I'm raising here, because researchers have been talking for many years about the fact that what we learn, the way we learn it, and how we are taught is changing. I know in the earlier session, the speakers talk about the higher education, and I'm here also talking about K to 12 and the need for redesigning, re-engineering curriculum and pedagogy. This has implications for schools and higher education, as well as for lifelong learning. How many of us here remember our third grade social studies class or our sixth grade history class? Let's reinvent education to make it meaningful and relevant so what our kids learn today has positive implications to their own futures and the future of the world. So, if this is the challenge, what are the solutions? To move toward learner-guided education, learners' competency development must be placed at the core of the curriculum, because the curriculum, what we teach, and the pedagogy, how we teach, are no longer distinct things. They are integrated as one design piece, and at the foundation of this is the learner's agency. The important question here I want to raise, how do we get there? How to help schools do this? Of course, changing curriculum and assessment is hard, and changing school philosophy and organizations to focus on this concept, learner agency, is even harder. But this is something that we are trying to do in the Innovation Lab, Innovation Hub project at Qatar Foundation, in the unit I am leading at WISE. Here I'm sharing a few slides, but you can find the full report on our website. The Innovation Hub is a platform and a network of experts, researchers, and designers who support schools to set up their innovation lab inside their school. The lab serves as a research and design unit, as an engine to support schools on the ground. How they do that? By identifying areas of innovations that help drive schools in positive and effective directions to advance both student learning and well-being. We began this project early 2020, before pre-COVID. We started with the 3 schools, 2 in Qatar and 1 in Australia. A lot of this work has centered on capacity building of teachers and school leaders to embrace new mindsets, and to incubate new ideas and change in their approach to education delivery. Each school has its own unique journey, and it's been fascinating to see their growth. Of course, each school, each classroom has a unique context. So when we design these solutions, we need to consider that as well. I'll share some of the findings from this study. Again, the full report is available on our website to be downloaded, and it's available in English and in Arabic. The first finding, it was necessary when we talk about innovation in schools, we need to adapt to each school unique needs, goals, and variables. Number 2, to be effective, we need to have the school, to focus on the school practices. So if school X are focusing on improving reading, for example, other school about using technology. So we need to consider unique. We can't have just one solution for all these schools. Number 3, the role of educational leadership is so important. And I think the speakers talked about this in higher education. The same with K-12. We need to have school leaders who are open to risk-taking, who embrace failure, and to support in having new practices and incubating new solutions. And finally, the need for deep change, because what we found is, we need to consider the redesign of learning environments towards more meaningful personalized learning, and that will be necessary to keep up with the change, because the learning environments is so important when we talk about the human, the capacity building for the human resources as well. So this is the full report. Going back to my to the concept I shared today, that COVID has in some respect been a great positive disruptor, because it forced schools to be innovative in ways they never imagined. It also helped the schools realize that drastic change in education was possible. So in a sense, every school became innovative. So it has been great to see all this movement in the field of education. COVID disrupted education around the world, although it sent shock waves across education systems. Many of the challenges the pandemic raised and the creative solutions that arose to meet them were far from new. These challenges need to be rapidly addressed if our education systems are to set up every young person to thrive and to prepare them well for their futures. So to conclude my presentation today, real reform is more than a combination of quick fixes and short-term interventions aimed at putting band-aids on an already gaping sore. It's about fundamental change by identifying root causes, and redesigning models that support learners' agency and teachers' empowerment. So, of course, I couldn't cover all these elements of this study. We spent almost 2 years in the implementation phase and learning from this project. So, to answer my question, to redesign, re-engineering the schools, the last slide here. Number one, we need to redesign the education system around actual student learning rather than the number of hours spent in a classroom. Number two, we need to move toward learner-guided reform, where learners' competency development must be placed at the core of what we teach and how we teach, combining pedagogy and curriculum at the same time, and assessment, of course. And finally, research and design should serve as a driver or engine for root cause identification and fundamental changes to schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Asma. Can I suggest that you stay there, because I'm fairly sure that colleagues will want to comment. And we have our first comment, second table back. But while the microphone is just being taken across, I think there were some very nice links between what you were sharing from the research that you have done and what Michael Murphy in particular this morning was sharing from his position. And this business of more happening outside the university and the learner-centered agenda, I think there's quite a close correlation there. And my second point is you were talking of research of the school sector. I sometimes think in higher education we would do well to look more closely at what is actually happening in the school sector, particularly pedagogically. But there's just a couple of off-the-top thoughts. We have a proper question now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity and a good, nice presentation. I really like the way schools are planning the renovation and the redesign of education, something that is quite relevant as well to higher education, and especially in our region. So earlier, the first two speakers focused on the idea or the comparison and the commonalities between the regions. And I've got one in commonality that I would like to highlight in light of the talk of Asma. Education generally in the Middle East and the regions where we come from are more knowledge-based. And I think that challenge of changing it into a skill-based education was, in a way, not being very much highlighted. And I would like really to commend Asma for looking at the skills and learner-centered education, developing personal learning processes at school levels. And this is something we really need to look at higher education level, especially in our region. For example, I've seen in this country a chemical engineer working as, he's now, after 3 years of graduation, he's a chartered accountant. So he was hired by one of the top accounting firms in the world, but he's a chemical engineer. And this is something impossible to see in our area because we look at the knowledge rather than the skills. You can see a mechanical engineer working as a financial analyst with Goldman Sachs in London. And I have seen one. And we are still looking at a business student needing to do an IT project that is related to business, but his university is refusing to accept the degree to come from an IT department. We want it to come, same supervisor, same project, same students, but we want the degree to come from just the IT department. So we really need to look at this model. Is very good, an excellent model, a little bit of large scaling, taking it over to our universities, and especially now with the COVID. I'm sorry, I made it like a comment rather than a question, but I would like Asma to comment comment on it as well. So, given the COVID situation and the globalization of education, that will help a lot into that line, whereby skill-based education can be learned and the skills and the technology can easily be transferred. Well done, Asma, for the presentation and the approach. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this challenge in education has been in place for many years. There is a gap in skills, there is a gap in the preparation of students for higher education or for the workplace. What we did in this Innovation Hub, Innovation Lab project, the theoretical framework for this project based on the work of OECD, the 2030 Compass, where they have the learners at the center of what we should do when we design the curriculum and any content in the schools. So we use that as a theoretical framework, but our practice in schools, we have the school and we try to create or build the innovation lab in each school with the support from my team. So we have a mix of the school, designers, researchers, to identify an area that they want to support instead of having a ready-made suggestion from outside the school. They know what they need to do. Each school principal, they know their teachers and their and teachers, they know their students and classrooms. So that was the concept of that. It wasn't an easy journey for us to support research on the ground because workload of teachers, the mindset of some of the schools, even us, they considered us as an external. So we needed to build the trust to support the school. So many variables affected, but at the end, we came up with these findings from the 3 schools. But looking forward for such a project, scaling up and including more schools would be great, either in Qatar or outside. But that was like a pilot stage to test the model and to test the role of teachers and learners at the beginning. And what we found, yes, we started a few months before COVID, but I found COVID as a crisis and disconnection helped us to identify and help schools to identify their priorities. So this is what I want to share, and the role of leadership as well, because in this project, moving from the traditional way of teaching, where we help teachers and schools identify their areas.
If you could just change your screen so you can see the chat. There is a question from Yara Wilson from the United States. What you're asked is, do those students who transition into different fields that are from another degree background, do they have the social capital or connections to be able to secure those jobs? That might affect equity if somebody has to study and work, then graduate with less connections. In the USA, it matters who you know, and I suspect that's true of a number of other countries as well. Do you have a quick observation on that?
So just to make sure I understand the question correctly, is she asking about access to quality education? Can you explain the question?
It's difficult to pick that. Do they have the social capital? In other words, are they qualified by both the sort of the attitudes, the connections, and the experience, as well as the knowledge to
You
move
mean as
into the
an
new fields?
outcome of this project or as a
No.
process?
No, as a process.
As a process. Well,
Yeah.
as I mentioned in one of the slides, learners learn differently.
Yeah.
So when we talk about even teachers as well, because part of this project is to support teachers as researchers. So both teachers and learners learn differently. In my introduction, when I talked about um, reform in general, we need to help teachers lead their learning. And there is a type of learning we want to encourage in schools. One of these is it needs to be built on research evidence and learn how to use, how to change their practices based on the research. Now, going back to the earlier question, I think yes, learners and teachers learn differently. They have different behavior to change. They have different attitudes, and so on.
Well, Asmaa, thank you very much